This is the Chapter 3 Cumulative Review video number 8. So we are well into Chapter 3 material at this point in the review, and we are going to now start with graphing linear functions. So notice that these three equations are all written in function notation, which at this point you guys should be familiar with. So f of x, w of x, and h of x, those all just mean y. The other thing that you guys should notice is that all of these equations are written in slope-intercept form. So if you're still struggling with slope-intercept form, that is y equals mx plus b. The m in the equation is your slope. That tells you how many to rise and run when you're graphing. And the b is your y-intercept. And that's going to tell you where to start out on your graph. So looking at number 44, you should be able to identify m, and you should be able to identify b. Since there's no number being added or subtracted, b, which is your y-intercept, is actually 0. So I'm going to start my graph at the origin. The slope in this case is 2, which is a whole number, so remember you put that over 1. So I am going to rise 2 and run 1 to the right from the origin. Then I'm going to take a straight edge and I'm going to draw a line. Remember that your slope, if it's a positive number, then your graph should slope up from left to right. Okay, let's go ahead and look at number 45. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify my slope, which is m, and my y-intercept, which is b. In this equation, I see that there is a minus 2. So the negative 2 is where my graph is going to start. That's my y-intercept. So I'm going to place a point on negative 2 on the y-axis. My slope in this case is 1/3. That tells me how many to rise and run from the point on my y-axis. So I rise 1 this time, and I run 3 to the right, and I put another point. Then I draw a line. You need at least 2 points in order to graph a straight line. Notice that this line is less steep than my first line because my slope is a fraction. Alright, looking at number 50, this one is slightly different because they actually put the constant, which is your y-intercept, first. So remember, your slope is always the coefficient of x. So b in this case is 4. My slope is negative 7. Since that's a whole number, I'm going to also put that over 1. So I'm going to put my first point on 4 on the y-axis. And then because my slope is negative, I'm going to fall 7 and run 1 to the right. Moving in that downward position is the negative part, and then I still run right to make my line slope down because that 1 was positive. And then I'm going to draw a line through those points. Now notice that my lines here on the iPad are not very straight. I encourage you to use a straight edge. Most of you have been using the side of your ID or the side of a paper in order to draw that line straight. The next portion of your review is reviewing x and y intercepts. Remember, if a line or an equation is written in standard form, that means the x and the y are on the same side of the equal sign, then it's easy to calculate your x and y intercepts. Remember, that is where the point on the x-axis or the point on the y-axis on your graph. So in order to calculate that, if I'm looking for the x-intercept, then that means your y-coordinate would be 0. So for number 51, in order to calculate my x-intercept, I am going to do 2x plus 4 times 0 equals 8. Remember, when you're calculating your intercepts and you substitute in 0 for one of the variables, you should see x if you're looking for the x-intercept. The actual variable x should still be in your equation. If you're looking for your y-intercept, then you should see the y variable in your equation. Okay, so from this point we wind up with 2x equals 8. The opposite of multiplying by 2 is to divide by 2, and we find out that our x-intercept must occur at 4. In order to calculate your y-intercept, you are going to plug in 0 for x. So we have 2 times 0 plus 4y equals 8. That leaves us with 4y is equal to 8. The opposite of multiplying by 4 is to divide by 4. And when I do that, I find out that y is equal to 2. If you had to graph this, what you would do is you would put a point on 4 on the x-axis, a point on 2 on the y-axis, and then you would draw a line between those points. You should be able to do 52 and 53 based on the example that I just did for you. This last problem we have in this section is a word problem. This is also similar to a problem that we did on our notes in Chapter 3, so this isn't the first time you've seen a problem like this. So let's start out by just looking at the problem and kind of figuring out what's going on. So it says that you are ordering warm-up clothes for the basketball team. Mesh shirts cost $16 each, and cotton shirts cost $8 each. You have a budget of $240 for the shirts. They're actually giving us the equation. It is 16x plus 8y equals 240, and that models the total cost where x is your mesh shirts and y is your cotton shirts. So the first thing that it asks us to do is to graph the equation and interpret the intercepts. So in order to graph, I need to calculate my intercepts. So that's what I'm going to do first. I'm going to do that the same way I did on the last problem. So I have 16x plus 8 times 0 equals 240. If I solve this equation, it's going to give me my x-intercept. So when I wind up with 16x equals 240, I am going to divide 240 by 16 in order to isolate x, and I am going to find out that x is equal to 15. In order to calculate my y-intercept, I am going to plug in a 0 for x, and I am going to solve the resulting equation for y. So I wind up with 8y equals 240. If I divide both sides by 8, I find out that y must be equal to 30. Now notice these numbers are fairly large, so it would be difficult to graph if I used a scale of 1, but you can always change your scale and go by 5s if you need to. So that's what I would suggest that you do. I'm actually also going to change this into a 1-quadrant graph because for this word problem, it wouldn't make sense to have negative numbers of shirts. Make sure you go back to the problem and figure out that x was our mesh shirts, so I'm going to label my x-axis as mesh, and y was cotton, so I'm going to label that as cotton shirts. That way I don't get confused when I'm graphing. Okay, so I'm going by 5s, so if my x-intercept is 15, that would be 5, 10, 15. And my y-intercept is 30, so 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. And now that I have 2 points, I can draw a line. Okay, so we've graphed. Now they want us to interpret. Interpret means to tell what the values mean in context of the problem. So think about that x-intercept. The coordinates for that would be 15, 0. What does that mean in the context of this problem? What it means is that they could afford to buy 15 mesh shirts if they didn't purchase any cotton shirts. And I get that by looking at what the variables stand for. Then on the other side of that, for the y-intercept, that would be 30 cotton t-shirts if they bought no mesh shirts. And this should make sense to you because if you substituted those values back into your equation, it's going to equal 240, which was what their budget was for the purchase of these shirts. Okay? Alright, for letter B, it says that 4 players decide they want the cotton shirts. How many mesh shirts can you order? So they are giving you a value for cotton. Remember, cotton was your y coordinate or your y variable. So all you have to do is substitute in a 4 and solve for x. So I'm going back to the original equation, which was 16x plus 8y equals 240, but they are telling me that cotton, which is y, is equal to 4. So I now have 16x plus 8 times 4 is equal to 240. And I'm going to solve that. So 8 times 4 is 32. I would move 32 to the other side by subtracting, and I would wind up with 16x is equal to 208. If I divide both sides by 16, I get 13. So if they purchased 4 cotton shirts, they could also afford to purchase 13 mesh shirts. That brings us to the end of this video. If you have any questions and this video did not answer them, please make sure you come in for tutorials. Have a great evening.